We appreciate those who are joining live because you have at least the opportunity to ask questions live and chime in with answers as I sometimes throw questions out to the listeners. And so if you're joining us for the first time, we are an open forum podcast. You can ask questions at any time related to the topic, and then we will open it up at the end for off-topic questions. So if you have any questions at all throughout the podcast, feel free to throw them in. And tonight, topic title is Uncomplicate Your Life. For some reason, this autocorrects and makes it uncomplicated, which looks funny, but uncomplicate is a word. I actually looked it up. Apparently, it is a real word. I already had this topic in mind. It just kind of was something that was, it just kind of came into my mind as I was listening to a book, and a statement was made about trying to solve problems, certain problems in an engineering endeavor, and just making the complicated simple is something that kind of started flowing through my mind. And then I was thinking about how easy it is for life to become complicated to the point where people just kind of live under this sustained pressure. And so that's kind of what started. And I don't mean like a good pressure. I mean a pressure that it doesn't benefit you. It doesn't help you. You don't know how to handle it. And so that's why I entitled this Uncomplicate Your Life. And it fit right in because last night I had to come in. Our church has this stage, and underneath the stage, a lot of wires are run to either side of the stage. And there's like kind of central point where everything plugs in and then goes back to our soundboard. And so over time, this has just turned into a massive rat's nest. And I have a picture. I could have actually posted the picture up. I didn't really think about it till right this second, but it was horrible. And I got a little confession here. I grew up in the low voltage trade, and so I did wires. That's what I did. One of the reasons why I left that to become an electrician is because I saw what electricians were doing. It looked similar. It looked in the same vein as what I was doing already, but the mess was so much less. Messy wires, especially to that level, it does something to my brain that I haven't yet learned to cope with. And if I'm honest, you could even call it a phobia. It's something physical begins to happen when I see it. I feel genuinely uncomfortable. It's almost like an anxiety I feel, and so I don't like touching it. So it's something that had to be done, and I put it off for a long time. And Pastor Ford threatened my life, and so I finally did it. And I asked for forgiveness. I put it off. It was my fault, but I did it. I asked one of the brothers to come in and help me, and so we spent a few hours just untangling this massive mess. And as I was doing it, I was thinking about the podcast for today, and just kind of thoughts are rolling through my mind as I'm sifting through these wires. And I just began to relate how easy it is to, over time, let things pile up to the point where you can no longer handle them, or they just have to be completely taken apart and put back together. And so as I'm going through this, I'm noticing a pattern of iterations, and we could call it even, changes over generations of changes. And so you have wires that aren't being used. You've got adapters plugged into adapters, and you've got coils that are way too long and don't need to be that long. And so I'm looking at this. We're sifting all this out, and by the time we were done, although it's not beautiful, it's underneath the stage, it's clean, it's practical, and it's simple. And so now we can easily go in there, take things out when we want to, put things back in. We can change things with relative ease. And as long as that's maintained, it'll stay that way. But it just made me think about how over time, life can just become too complicated. And so we have these like different reactions, is that we get to a point where we look at the mess and we go, I can't handle this. And so we do nothing. Or we're just lazy and we let things build up to a point where we literally can't do anything about it. And there's no real clear path forward anyway. There obviously something can always be done, but is there a real end in sight? Is there a practical, reasonable time frame to get things done? Or we're just so unorganized and haven't learned to properly triage and consolidate things and deal with things one problem at a time. And so we can get overwhelmed in our thinking. And I was just thinking about all that, putting this all together thinking about scriptures in the Bible, like when Jesus tells the Pharisees that your blind guides you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And I was thinking about just that whole concept being so complicated. And so I've said all that, and because I know how Pastor Ford's brain works fairly well, I know he's got a bunch of thoughts going through his brain right now, and he's thinking about things, and he's probably thinking about scenarios, maybe even people and circumstances that he's dealt with. And so I just want to stop there and say, what does that trigger in your brain?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that is a, what you're talking about is a sin of your youth, kind of a thing, to let stuff pile up like that. Because it's something that over time, as you get older, you begin to realize, living like that just makes life more difficult, because you can't move forward because you're in a tangled mess of problems. And so, usually the kinds of places where this stuff manifests itself is in finances. People will get themselves into a situation to really want something. They don't have the money for it, so they'll get a credit card, and then they'll start charging things on a credit card, and then that gets too high, and now they have a problem paying it back. And so they still want to spend, they still want to go out, they still want to do things, but now they not only don't have the money, but they have this huge credit card debt, and there's interest on the credit card debt. So that is accruing and getting worse and worse and worse. And so you're just going to push it off. And at some point, when you live life like that, when you're always saying, "Oh, I got to take care of this, but I'm not going to take care of it today," the day will come, and it'll be more than once, and I know people who have cleared off, all the problems of their lives, and then went right back into them again and got into another snarled mess all over again. And they just seem to go from mess to mess, I've heard people who they give a testimony of how they got free from this thing or that thing or the other thing, and then it will be, a few years later where they will say that they got, free from this thing or that thing or the other thing. And it's like, didn't you already talk about that from years ago? And it's, oh, no, it happened again, and I got free again. And it's like, no, you didn't. You didn't. You just cleared off the problem. Now you're going to start over again, building another problem. And so it's a lack of learning lessons, so it's a growth issue when it comes right down to it, is the putting things off and working around things, rather than resolving them.
Mm-hmm. So when he makes this statement in when Jesus is, this is like this section, I guess, is referred to as the 7 woes. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and it's like 7 rebukes to these Pharisees, or warnings is probably a better way of describing it. But he talks about this idea of straining out a gnat or swallowing a camel.
Right.
How does that, what does that look like in real life? Because obviously he's using an analogy here, but
yeah.
What does that?
Well, it's interesting. That I don't. It can be related to what we're talking about, but it's kind of another thing, because what he's talking about there is he's talking about people who they get caught up in the minute details of things, and they're not dealing with the practical realities of things, and so that can be one of the causes, of what we're talking about, of life becoming complicated, mm-hmm. is because you're only focusing on minute detail that is not essential. Mm-hmm. It's, the phrase is called majoring on the minors.
Mm-hmm. So trying to, with the goal of trying to relate this to everybody listening, is what are some reasons that life becomes complicated? Maybe not, but it doesn't. We don't have to go so extreme. Yeah. But what are things that people do that complicate things?
Well, this is where the Bible comes in. Is I'm surprised at how many people that claim, they claim to believe in God. They claim, that the Bible is the Word of God. They make these kinds of claims, but yet then they violate it. And what's interesting to me is, so I'd say as a pastor, the common experience is that I've observed is that somebody will come in, they'll realize that this is the answer to escape the tangle, that they've gotten themselves into. And so they'll become a Christian with the idea of escaping that tangle and, obviously to know God and have a relationship with God, have eternal life. But for the most part, it's the idea of the escape, from the entanglement of whatever they haven't been entangled by. And that happens, and it usually happens really, fairly quickly, because it's something that usually you get delivered from. But then they stop there. And that's the thing that for me is the most peculiar, is people who, it's like if you took 3 snapshots of their lives, you take one of them before they become a Christian, and then you take another snapshot of them maybe 6 months to a year later, and then you take another snapshot of them, many, many, many years later. The only difference between the second and third snapshot is that they've gotten older physically, that they will have gray hair or, something like that, but nothing's changed. It's like everything that God did in their lives happened in that first year. And the reason is because they really don't apply the Word of God to their lives. They learn it so they can tell it to other people and try to get other people to apply it, but they personally don't apply it to their lives. And it's interesting, having, like I said, is listening to conversations of things that people say. You can tell, even after 5, 10, 15 years of being saved, they're still guarding, or not guarding, but they're still having to be careful what they say in church. You can tell, that they're having to be careful that they don't cross the line, and it's like, how come you're still doing that? How come you're wrestling with this? And the reason is because there's no application of the Word of God to their lives. It's all just about, keeping the rules. And that's all it is. And so, and then there are people who, it's something I'm going to be talking about a little bit tomorrow, is, they don't, their mind hasn't been changed. Their works have changed, but their thinking hasn't changed at all. They're still the same. And so the tangle, the real tangle, which is sin, generally speaking, that never goes away. And so sin is the most common, and a lack of repentance. And repentance isn't stop doing it. Repentance is understanding the right way to think about it. And then you stop doing it. You stop doing it because you think this is a dumb idea, not because it's a rule,
So what do you think is like I was going to say struggle, but, what is the barrier, or the it is kind of a struggle, but what is it? What is the thing that holds people back from just, doing the right thing? I know it's a really elementary question.
Yeah, yeah. It is a simple answer, is because people want to do what people want to do, and that's the important concept to understand about why God sent Jesus to the earth to die on the cross for our sins is not because there are bad people in the world, but because none of us seeks after God. None of us is righteous. None of us is holy. Everybody is unrighteous. And there wasn't going to be any way that we could ever make our way back. And so like I said, people want to do what people want to do. And so what people want to do is sin. What we want to do is, for the most part, sinful. But it's what we find pleasure in, and so we want to do it. And so often what happens is people will come into the church with the idea of, how can I be less sinful? Not how can I become sin free? And it's a real conflict throughout denominations, this idea of sin and what sin is and how sin works, and the idea that there are big sins and there are little sins and all that, but the truth is that we're sinners, and that is the problem. And so we sin because we're sinners. And so what happens is people don't actually stop being sinners. They become I'll label it as saved sinners. They still sin, they still live in sin, but they have a religious bone now that they need to scratch.
The thing that's still kind of working through my mind here is the fact that, like, there are things that habits that I have and things that I personally look at, and it's like I need, these are things that I'm working on fixing and developing and growing in and growing sometimes out of, and ways of thinking that I look at, and this is not right. This way of thinking isn't right. There have been times my wife and I were just talking about something similar to this the other day, is that they're like, your initial reaction to a thing. We were talking about the issues of like anger and irritation and attitudes, and how your initial response can be as small as a thought or a feeling, right?
Yeah.
And what dictates, maturity a lot of times, or what is a sign of maturity is what you do before that becomes the expression outwardly. It's like being able to like control that and draw the line further and further back.
That is the point. Is it's not so much not letting it get to the outside, it's being able to deal with it immediately when it happens. And so at a thought level. So, by the time it gets to the outside, it's too late. You've already
So that's what I'm saying, is that there's something working that says that's not going to dictate me. I'm not going to be that person.
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's the issue, is not being. And that's the thing, not being a slave to sin.
Yeah.
That's the thing that some people don't understand is that idea, because we are slaves. Jesus said if you're involved in sin, you become a slave to it. You're a slave to it. But just because we're happy slaves doesn't make us not slaves. And so that's the issue, is that it's a bondage.
So describe that, like work into that issue of a slave. What does that mean? Because a slave to me is somebody who is in bondage. You don't have a choice.
You don't. Right? You don't have a choice when it comes right down to it.
So what you want to do is kind of irrelevant at that point. Then
technically it's irrelevant, because you are making a choice to do something that you shouldn't do. And you're not going to make that choice, but you want to do it, so you're going to do it, and you're not going to think about it from the standpoint of a choice.
So it sounds like, I'm trying
so that's what I mean by slave,
is
that you just do it. It's just, no, I don't have a choice here. I won't be happy if I don't do this, so I'm going to do it, and so the idea, and you just ignore the idea of being a slave, you just, I'm not, because I'm happy, therefore I'm not a slave.
So is that similar to like being an addict? Is it like the similar dynamic?
Yeah, I mean there's a great book called I can't remember the whole title, but Scarcity, the Scarcity Brain. That's it. He talks about it, which was a concept I'd never really considered when it comes to that idea of addiction. Is the idea of an addict is making an addiction, making a decision that either I can take this hit now and be happy, or I cannot take this hit and be miserable. I may die from taking that hit, but at least I'll die happy rather than to live miserable. And so that is an ultimate slave mentality, because those aren't the only two options. It isn't. There are a lot of people who are not addicted to stuff,
right?
And they're quite happy not being addicted. It isn't. An addict is not experiencing happiness beyond what other people experience. It has become, because of the slavery, It has become his only source of happiness because of his limited opportunities, because of his slavery. And that's the issue. So some people, they say, oh, I love going out to clubs. Well, it's not that you love going out to clubs. It's that you don't have other options anymore for happiness. You don't have any other options. There are plenty of options for happiness, but those things don't make you happy anymore because you're a slave. And so the only thing that makes you happy is to be with your master, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the only way the only way that I can think of to help anyone to understand the idea of what it means to be a slave to sin is from that perspective, is the idea of, if you find things that are sinful are the only things that you can find happiness in, then you are a slave, and that's why. And so your master is keeping you from being able to enjoy things that are not sinful. Mm-hmm. You don't have the capacity. It's not that there isn't a capacity to have. It's been taken from you by your master.
I can remember times when I'm like, when I was, addicted to like pain pills and trying to. The only way I can think of this, the only way I can really describe the feeling is like, when I was a kid, we used to do this thing called, I think we called it, there's a name for it. The name really doesn't matter, but it's going to bug me. So I used to skateboard. Mm-hmm. What we'd do is, cars driving by, we would skate out into the street. We'd grab onto people's bumpers, mm-hmm. and we would just roll until either they got mad at us, or if it was a friend or something, like, it goes faster, go faster. Yeah. But imagine that, but like you're chained to the back of the car.
Yeah.
And you know that if you let go of this wheel, it's all you're gonna get hurt, right?
Yeah.
And so you're trying to keep your balance, but you have no control over how fast you're going, what direction you're going, and you can't let go.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it felt like. The thing is, there was this thing in the background, very, very deep. Over time, it got very, very, very deep, and it almost felt like it wasn't there at all. It was there, but it wasn't on the forefront of my mind. But there was this thing, I don't want to do this. Yeah. I don't want to do this. And there was this it almost felt like instead of wheels, it was more like my feet were dragging on the ground, and I'm just like, I can't do anything about it, but to not want to do it. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, the issue of desire seems to be so, or I should say, it can be so conflicted. And it's like, I want to do this, but I don't want to do this. And there's this thing, or like you said, where you're doing because you're a slave. You don't want, even if you don't want to do it, you don't have a choice. Yeah. How do you, what's the I was gonna say workaround. That's definitely not right. What's the without, I don't want to go that far yet. How do you describe the conflict there? How is it that we can be forced to do things we don't want to do?
Well, like I said, it's so. I mean, there are chemical reasons for that, because the whole idea of dopamine.
Well, specifically relating to sin in general. Is
well,
that the same?
It's all the same. It's
okay.
all part of it. Yeah, it's all part of it. The attraction, really, the attraction to sin, and if you, wherever you are in life, if you think about when you initially started doing a thing, to the point that you're doing that thing still, that is sinful, you will find that it is not as pleasing as it was in the beginning. It is almost a necessity. It's the pleasure is in fulfilling the necessity, as opposed to the actual rush or the thrill of the thing itself. And so that's the problem. So like for example, even something like anger, you think, why would somebody get angry at somebody else? Well, the reason that somebody gets angry at somebody else is because they want to have power over them. That this is the idea behind anger. What motivates anger is the idea of having power over somebody else. And there are other ways that are more effective in gaining control of a situation. But that one is an easy one because you just scream and yell and just, shout the other person down, and then you win. Even if you don't have the facts, even if you don't have the logic, and even if you're totally wrong, you can still play that game. And there's a satisfaction that takes place from that, because you won. Even if you were wrong, you still won, and winning is the idea. And so anger is the opportunity for you to win, and winning becomes the prize, ultimately, rather than being right. And so that's why you have people that are just angry people, and they blow up all the time, and they blow up at all kinds of people, and they're always yelling and screaming, is because they are that is how they find their satisfaction to their master, is through that, because there are other options and there are other ways to find that fulfillment. Fulfillment's probably the better way to describe it, because you don't want to get too caught up on the idea of it being an emotional experience as much as an experience that is, that there's a satisfaction that has taken place. So it's not necessarily an emotional thing as much as I've satisfied this need, at this point in my life. And so I think that's an important factor in understanding, that the whole concept, of being a slave, to sin, and, getting back to the idea of why our lives are so tangled up, is because we don't have options to untangle, because untangling is hard work. Untangling doesn't satisfy. Untangling is the work without pleasure, to just simply get back to the place to where you can start experiencing fulfillment again. So.
Okay, so let's kind of jump in the middle here before we kind of go on to some solutions. But like, what is the hesitation in behind like the work part of it, and like, what is the, so let's say you want to do it, but there's a lacks of experience, or attitudes that might you're doing it the wrong way or something like that. Like what are some like wrong roads people go down when trying to, like, we'll just call it, get organized and learn how to deal with problems correctly and stuff like that? What are some pitfalls people fall into, things that people do or don't do that either lead to more mess or just lead to things being stagnant, not ever moving forward?
Yeah, I would say probably the first thing that comes to my mind is that people, the decisions that people make about addressing issues in their life are usually over optimistic. They're gonna change everything in one day. Rather than going after a thing. So like, it's the classic, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? You don't think about how big the elephant is. You think about your next bite, and just worry about that. When you get to the point to where you can't eat anymore, now you deal with that issue, but you don't deal with it at the beginning, because it's too overwhelming. And so making bite-sized decisions in life are the most critical in order to unravel issues.
Okay, what else? So simplifying things seems to be one at a time, dealing with things on a practical level.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Yeah, is you have a problem, or some issue that you're trying to address in your life. A good example. I was just I sent an email to a friend of mine today he's in his 70s and he wants to learn Spanish, and he had mentioned, one of the things about learning a language. He said, from the things that he's read, which I've read as well, and is true, is that learning a language really isn't about how much effort that you put into it. It's how much effort you put in every day. So 20 minutes every day, or 10 minutes. One course that I had said just practice 10 minutes a day. Some of these courses I've seen them, they're like, they want an hour and a half lesson every day. And it's like, man, that's just way too much. It's way too much, unless you're super dedicated and maybe you're under the gun and you have to learn a language within, I don't know, 6 months or something like that. An hour and a half, is probably, the way to do it. But it realistically, it's 10 or 15, 20 minutes is a far better approach, because after that you can get back to what you need to do, and so it's not as daunting of a task.
Okay. What about seeking advice and education? Like, how often do you think people like actually try to learn about how to solve their problems and how to work things through?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I don't know that I could quantify that as much as to say that it's how important it is. You have to be a learner, all your life. If you're ever going to achieve anything with your life, if you want your life to become something, you're going to have to always be a learner. And what I mean when I say learner is not just, gathering information. You have to learn how to put into practice the things that you're learning regularly and daily. So you can't just store up information and think you're going to save it. Information is a use it or lose it thing. You don't store it. You may remember stuff and you may be able to have conversations, but what happens is you turn into the kind of person, and no doubt all of us have experienced this, of somebody who doesn't matter what you say, they know something about it, but yet you look at their life and their life is achieving very little. They're not really learning anything. They just have a storage of information, and the information that they give, when you actually, if you actually get to the point of trying to implement it, you'll find their advice doesn't work, because the information is it's antiseptic. It doesn't have any real world experience behind it to make it actually practical, and so it just becomes just rules for life.
So I'm gonna try and pull some stuff out of you here, because you're a pastor, and you've been a pastor for a while, and so how because we're talking in the context of being a Christian, and you're talking about how living in sin is what complicates life, and or at least one of the major contributors to complicating life, so in a minute
I think it's important to understand that living in sin, you have to get rid of this religious definition of what that means. Is that being an evil person to other people, that other people look at you and think you're an evil person. That's not what it means to live in sin at all. Mm-hmm. And living in sin is not just living with your boyfriend or girlfriend. Living in sin is just simply an attitude that says, I'm not too terribly concerned about what right or wrong is. What my concern is what makes me feel good. And that's the danger, is living in that realm of just living based on what makes you feel good. So I'd say that's probably a good definition.
I'm sorry, I'm jotting some questions and notes down here as you're talking, but so you, again, the context here, you're a pastor, and you I mean, let's be honest, you deal with a lot of people's problems. You are sometimes very shoulder to shoulder, sometimes you're face to face with people and their problems, and so from the standpoint of trying to help people through their problems, be it counseling, discipling, working with people to bring them to salvation, essentially, bringing people to convert to Christianity and introducing them to this life, and then walking them through that life, sometimes step by step. But, what is your experience with trying to help people through their problems? How often are folks receptive? What do you think are like some major pain points that
Yeah.
you, from your perspective, like these are things that,
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
better, but aren't because of XYZ?
A technique of pastoring, which is common. This isn't something that is just exclusive to me, and is wisdom. In general, is you're not going to tell people what to do. There's no point in telling people what to do, because they will do what you say. And if they want to do what you say, then it will work. If they don't want to do what you say, it will not work. And so there's no point in telling people what to do. You have to give people choices and let them decide the path that they want to go on by communicating the benefits and the disadvantages, pros and cons. That kind of, well, this is a good idea. It has this involved in it. There could be some negatives. This thing over here could be this or that. But out of all of these, this one will give you the opportunity to do this, that, or the other thing. Blah blah blah. And then they can walk away and they can decide whatever they want. But the amazing thing to me is how many people that they want advice, and the advice that they usually end up taking, and I should put advice in commas, in quotes, is the advice that they wanted to all along. And so they come in and we're talking, and I'm telling them the pros and cons of the things that they're talking about. I'm offering some other suggestions, which in my mind, sometimes, not always, but in my mind, are better. They're better options for them. And for the most part, most people will stick with their first original thing. They don't actually come in with the idea of having their minds changed. They come in with the idea of bouncing something off, hearing their own thoughts, and then going away and doing what they wanted to do anyway. And so for the most part, and it may sound cynical to say this, but it's not cynicism, it's just simply the facts, is that for the most part, people, the majority of people are not actually learners, especially if they're over 20 years old. They're not a kid anymore, in their thinking. I'm not a kid anymore. I don't need daddy to tell me what to do. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is there's another phase that we're supposed to go through when we become adults, is that we're no longer, I always joke with my kids and well, not so much my kids now, but my grandkids. I joke with them. I say things like, just think, when you get older and you get a job, you can buy all the ice cream you want, But the truth is, when they get to be that age and they're having to start paying for it, they're not going to buy all the ice cream they want.
No.
Because they realize they can't do other things, because life only has a limited amount of resources. But when they're young, it's like, oh, I wish I was an adult already so I could buy all the ice cream I wanted, and I could do this, and I could do that, and I can do the other. And so life is just a series of limitations when you're a kid. But then as you begin to grow up, you begin to realize it's not just that life is a series of limitations when you're a kid. Life has limitations, period. And so you have to learn those things. You learn that. But so this is the issue, is that when you get to an age of an adult, different for different people, what exactly qualifies as adult. But you get to a point to where you're still thinking like a kid. You're still thinking about, how can I get all the things I want? And so that's where a lot of the problem is that, trying to work with people to get them to go in a right direction, is they just don't want to pay a price. They don't want to have to deal with the pain of making good decisions. They just want to feel good, So they like what I've been saying is they want to continue to live a life of sin. Mm-hmm. You say, well, having a career is not sinful. Having a bank account is not sinful. And we're very creative at being able to qualify, our sins, by calling them other things.
What would be like give me an example of like a real, what that really is?
Well, having a career is not a sin. We're not talking about you having a career. What we're talking about is that you are neglecting everything in order to get money. It's not about a career.
Yeah.
It's that your wife and your kids can stay home and live without you while you cha-ching, all day long. It's not about a career. You're not talking about a career. You're talking about an obsession. This is something you've become obsessive with, and that is sin. The Bible calls it selfish ambition, which most people don't even know that that's a sin. But yet it's America's number one sin. We teach our children that sin from a young age. Selfish ambition. Is we teach that. I didn't teach that to my kids, and I also had the privilege of living in England, where people in England don't teach their kids that either. And so not all countries teach their kids. It's an American sin that we pass on from generation to generation, and that's why we have the trouble that we have. Why things are getting more and more and more expensive all the time is because we teach our kids selfish ambition. You need to get more. You need to get more. You need to get more. But everything trickles down. Well, when you're getting more, you're costing the world more. Because the world has to supply you. With this thing.
It's interesting. I actually just my kids. I always chew gum. I have gum. It's just a thing that I always have, and my kids have gotten into this habit, or were getting into this habit of asking for gum every time they saw me. They'd always ask, "Oh, can we ride in your car?" They'd ride in my car. First thing you do, can I have a piece of gum? All the time. And gum's not cheap, man. Yeah. I got 5 kids, so even my son's asking for gum now. It's like, okay, I can't support your guys' habit here and mine at the same time. And so I came up with this idea of starting to charge my kids because they're making money now.
Yeah.
And all of them are across the board getting birthday money, Christmas money, Easter money. They're getting money for everything. Halloween money. And so I was like, you guys got cash, so all right, 50 cents a gum. And so from now on, every time you guys want gum, I'm going to charge you 50 cents. So I started doing it. And I got a little piggy bank at home. It's filled up with cash. But it stopped.
Yes.
It started slowing down little by little. And all of a sudden, they don't want to do it anymore. It's like you're starting to realize how this works now. You're getting it. It's expensive to do that. And so I think it's getting through. I think my son doesn't make money. So
but that's
got to work that through.
Yeah, that's a problem, though, is that, in life, people don't do that. They don't have that kind of understanding, and so untangling your life has to do with being able to make those kinds of choices, and being able to receive wisdom, and that's the funny thing is that, especially when it comes to Christianity, because here's let me put it objectively. If Christianity is real, okay, which I fully believe it is, there's a God, and God is the one who created the church. Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. And the Bible says that God gave gifts to the church, pastors, evangelists, prophets, and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, till we all can, for the edifying of the body, building itself up in love. And so here's this idea of growth, that comes from a pastor, because God has given the pastor to the church, and there's a divine wisdom that gets imparted to the pastor by God in order to impart that wisdom to the congregation. And so here you have this chain of God, pastor, congregation, and so there's a flow of wisdom that comes through that. And so you come to the pastor and say, this is my situation, this is what I'm dealing with, and so, okay, fine. And then there's a wisdom of God that gets brought into that circumstance that the pastor passes on, and so that wisdom gets passed on, or is supposed to get passed on. But then the person says, no, I think I'm going to go ahead and do what I thought in the first place. And, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's not an issue that, you're violating God by not listening to the pastor. But if you're not even going to consider that advice and think of it from the standpoint of its biblical relevance is probably a good enough word. That wasn't the word I was looking for, but a relevance, that yes, definitely this is scriptural and I need to do this, that there's a that's the kind of connection. Okay, well, you're thinking about this, you're thinking about that, you're thinking about the other thing, you want to do this, but this thing over here is biblical. This is going to lead you in another direction. And so, well, it's not sin, so I'm going to go in that direction. Well, it is sin. It is sin because it's disobedience to the will of God. You're saying, I'm not going to do the will of God because I want to do this thing over here. I'll circle back around at some point and try to fit that in. But right now I'm putting that on the shelf, and I'm not going to do it God's way. I'm going to do it my way. But it's not, it's not sin, because I don't see it as sin, and so even though it is sin, he who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to them it is sin. So the definition of sin is much, much lower than what most people think. But again, the idea of that is, and then there are the consequences that you read from that, and the consequences are, that you have to live this tangled life. I look at people and I look at the amount of limitations, that here they've been Christians for a long period of time, and the number of limitations on their life. They can't go, they can't do, they can't be, many things because of the decisions they've been making throughout their lives that has limited them. And they see it as holiness. They see it as, well, I'm being holy, and the goal of their lives is to not have anything to do with this life. And that defeats the whole point of God creating us. Because why would God create us and put us on this earth if there was no purpose in us being here? You can't fulfill your purpose. Mm-hmm. It's there's so many things that it's not that God doesn't want people to do those things, or that God isn't wanting to use them in that way. It's that they're disqualified. They've disqualified themselves because of their own will, and that ultimately is what it is. When you deal with life from that standpoint of what is sin, what isn't sin, and not think about things from the standpoint, is this the right thing to do, in this circumstance? Is this the right thing to do? Is this something, when God looks at what I'm doing, is God pleased that I'm living this way and making these decisions? And it's funny. I've heard people say, oh, I need to stop doing this. But they've been saying it for years and years and years. They've been saying, I need to stop doing this, or I need to do this. And they kept been saying it for years, but they never do. And the truth is, they probably never will, because it's now, when they should have done it, years before, it would have been much easier to do. But now it is so incredibly complex to be able to do it now. They probably will never be able to do it. Yeah. And so that's, this whole scenario of having a right definition of what sin is so critical to the whole thing. Sin, like I said, sin isn't just the handful of things that are mentioned in Galatians, of the works of the flesh. There's so much more, and at such a lower level. You see it as you read through the Bible, and if you're paying attention when you read through the Bible, you see how little tiny decisions things can become really, really complex afterwards. Just simple things like a King Uzziah. The thought that just kind of popped into my mind is, here's King Uzziah. Basically, he's on his way to being the perfect king. He's going to be the perfect king. So much so that he realizes, I am the perfect king. God is using me. I am successful. I am victorious. I have brought victory to Israel like nobody else has done. Kind of a sort of, no, never mind. It's not worth going there. But anyway,
I hate it when you do that.
Well, because it's
no,
just,
it's fair. It's fair. I'm not trying to push. It's just
it's
I'm listening,
slanted.
and then you stop and you go.
Yeah, it's slanted, so I need to change gears here. But so much so that he says, I'm going to go make an offering. He doesn't say, I'm going to go be a priest. He says, I am going to make an offering of incense to God. And so he goes into the temple, and the priests stand in the way, and they say, you're not allowed to do this. And he gets upset. He gets angry. He's not even to the point to where he's going to actually, start, okay, kill all the priests or whatever, because he is the king. But no sooner does he get angry, and before he even gets an opportunity to add insult to injury for the things that he's doing, leprosy appears. And so, and leprosy is like a no-go. Nobody's allowed in the temple with leprosy. And so they usher him out. No, you get out now. You have leprosy. And he died a leper. And so here's just one decision, a decision to go do something that looks good on the surface, because he's going to do it for God. The number of decisions that people make in life because they want to do it for God. But it's an independent decision, has nothing to do with God's leading. It's driven by ego. It's not driven by the prompting of the Holy Spirit. It's just driven by ego. And then, there's a pushback, from leadership in the church or brothers and sisters in the church. Oh, I don't think that's a good idea. You should talk to pastor about it. Or, examples like Uzziah in the Bible. It's like, no, I'm not going to listen to any of that. I'm just going to go do my thing. And then all of a sudden, warning, further complications coming. That's what happens next.
So it's interesting. You the way you're talking about this reminded me of the I got inspired when we were in Tucson. And I kind of had mentioned this to you. This idea of adding to your faith, and then he goes through virtue, knowledge, self-control, that stuff. And I was just thinking about how faith is like this starting place, right? This place of you're here now, right? It's the idea of being convinced of God. You are fully convinced of God's existence and your responsibility to Him and our accountability to Him. And then he says the very first thing to add in this, if you were to look at linearly, is virtue. And the word virtue means moral excellence, or a commitment to making the right decision.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, and it's funny that you mentioned it that way, because that's exactly the picture that I'm trying to paint of what happens, is that you add faith, and now faith, you can't put anything else on top of it. Yeah. Because there's an order. So you have to put virtue on, which is, like you said, that moral excellence and that excellence of, so the idea of making right choices, that becomes high. So now here is this thing, and it's like, nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
So they keep putting other things on top of it, and they just roll right back off. They put it on and just roll right back off. Put it on and just rolls right back off, because they're not willing to do the one thing that is the most critical, which is the key. The way that you said it as well is very important to understand, that whole idea of moral excellence. Not just doing what needs to be done, not just doing the necessities. Before you can add anything else to your faith, you have to add to your faith the ability to understand how critical everything is. Everything, the smallest of decisions. You have to be there first. Otherwise everything that you put on is just this bolt on, and it's sideways, and it's not working. It's like, it's like building something, and you start to build and you build. I get a great example. I have this, anybody who knows anything about 3D printing with ABS plastic is this really painful, because ABS plastic has this weird quality to it that as it's cooling, it shrinks. And so what happens is, because of the way that a 3D printer works, and it's one layer on top of another layer on top of another layer, what happens is if the area where it's building is not climate controlled, what will happen is those layers will cool. So you'll have one layer on top that's hotter than the one underneath, but that other one underneath is shrinking. And so what happens is, over time, you get this, and this just happened to me yesterday, 4-hour print that I just threw away. It wasn't very big, but I had to throw it away because it was what's called warping. And so what happens is, because of all the shrinking, the sides and everything start collapsing, and it looks like what happens to like a plastic bottle or something like that you put in your suitcase, and you go fly on, and then you open it and it's all sucked in. So that's what happened to it. Because of the warping and because of the uneven cooling. Because I thought, well, I'm just going to try it, because I knew this about it. I had that roll on there, so I thought, well, I'll just do it, because it was small. It was only going to be that tall, so I thought, well, maybe I won't do it. But sure enough, it did ruin the whole thing. 4 hours worth of waste, and that's how people, they're building their lives like that. is because they don't understand that every decision is like a layer. And that layer is going to have an effect on the next layer that goes on top of it. And they just don't think that way because they get these ideas and they make rash choices. And that really is what it comes down to, is people make rash choices, but they think that that's faith. They get an idea in their head and then they move on that idea because they believe that God is speaking to them about it, and they believe if they hesitate, then God isn't going to bless it. And so they move fast in presumption, not in faith. And then now they got a bad layer, and then they're going to put something else on top of that. And then eventually this thing is just going to start to just warp and come apart. And then you have, that complicated life as a result.
So it's 7:55. My last question really could branch off into more of that. If anybody has any off-topic questions, you're watching, even if you're watching after the fact and you have questions, we encourage you to use the comment section. We do see those, and so you're more than welcome to use that as a resource. But there's a scripture that I was thinking about, and I just kind of looked up the a few of the definitions just to try and get a little more of a refreshed understanding of what Jesus is saying. But he makes this like invitation to people: come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And so that word rest means rest or refreshing after the completion of a task.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of it's an interesting definition of a word. Because rest to us is like a break.
Yeah.
It's like we can stop in the middle of the project and just take a break.
Right.
Nothing's getting done,
yeah,
but
yeah.
this is a different kind of rest.
Right, yeah.
There's when you in the middle of a project, when you stop, you still are looking forward to the fact I still got to keep working. Mm-hmm. And so it's not real rest.
Right.
But when you finish something,
yeah,
it's like I've done it. There's a completion, and that's
Yeah.
real rest.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of rest. And so how do people merge? Because we talked a lot about kind of this middle, this like conflict between our desires and issues of sin and the proper order of things, mm-hmm. and how those things need to be in place in order for you to even get to solving problems. But how do people kind of merge over to that other side? What is the mindset? What's the decision that needs to be made that just essentially puts them in a place where they can experience what Jesus is talking about?
Say that again. I didn't quite follow that.
So what is the decision that people need to make? So we're talking about people that struggle with things either for a long time or whatever. They're just constant complications or never really getting over things. What is the decision that needs to be made in order for people to get there?
To that rest.
To that rest, yeah.
Yeah. So, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon me, you, and learn of me." Mm-hmm. And so those, that's the. If you think about that idea of virtue, and I really, that's a great thought, and it's something that I think that everybody should really, find some way to plug into their lives, write it down somewhere or, put it on someplace where you can see it again and again. The idea that our next step is virtue, and because that's kind of the decision, because he says, learn of me. And so learning of Jesus is learning of the virtuousness of Jesus, is in that appropriating that virtuousness,
like making decisions
to yourself.
The way that he made decisions.
Yeah. So making the decision. So the idea of virtue and seeing how Jesus made decisions, because it's funny, the old "what would Jesus do" thing, and I see it, and I think, and it's important, what would Jesus do? I did a thing a while back on that. What would Jesus do if he were me? Because it's far more than just what would Jesus do. We put Jesus and his priorities and his calling and his, life, and we try to use that as an example separated from ourselves, and it doesn't work, because you can't say, what would Jesus do? Because, would Jesus work a job? No, because he came to preach the gospel. Should we work a job? That depends on God's purpose for your life. So how do you decide what job, when, if you need to get a job, how do you figure that out? How do you work all that out? Well, you have to understand Jesus' virtue. Because it's Jesus' virtue that will help you to understand the parameters for everything. And that really is the issue. The issue is parameters, is that they're, it's funny, because the thoughts that are going through my mind of so many examples that we see in our world today of people that they're making decisions, and they're the wrong decision for their lives, and it's costing them, but they don't see it. They don't see that it's the wrong decision, and the reason is because they are not familiar with Jesus' virtue, or the probably the better way to describe it, the virtue of that decision. Like there are people who don't like, they think working is a bad idea. Having a job, working, oh no, that's worldly, that's carnal, that's ungodly, work, but yet I know, I can quote, for the sake of time I won't, but I could quote scriptures from the Bible that are very clear about the idea of work. Paul actually uses that in the book of Acts to say, you saw my manner, my conduct while I was here. I worked.
Yeah.
None of you had to supply for me, because I was able to work to supply for my own needs and for the needs of others, those who came with me. So he was showing the virtue, of being industrious. But yet there are people who call themselves Christians, and the idea of being industrious is, to them, that's worldly. It's carnal, because they just don't understand virtue, And so the decision to learn to be like Jesus, and then you have the resource of the Bible, you have church, hearing sermons preached, you have the life, the church life, of opportunities for, the interaction and things like that. And there are people, they come to church once a week. They don't develop deep relationships with people in church. They don't really do anything. They may read, and they may pray, and they may do things that are Christian disciplines. But as far as actually a Christian life, being an effective Christian life, their life isn't effective in any way. And the reason their life isn't effective is simply because they have not discovered the importance of adding virtue to their faith. So it's all about just, how can I exercise faith? I just want to exercise faith. So I'm not going to get a job. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do the other, because I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to live by faith. Well, that's not faith, because you have to put virtue on top of faith. And so you can't, if you can't do that, then it's not faith. You're not dealing with faith. You're dealing with something else, which is more pride than anything else. You're trying to build off of your pride and your ego of being able to say. I read this article, and I might bring it to church. It's about guys, and about not dating. Not dating and not getting married. How more and more men are moving in that direction and he's talking about this from that standpoint of not doing that, and he's like, you need to, you need to do this. You're all you're doing is hindering growth in your life by not pursuing things that are difficult for you.
So, okay, there's a question that came in, and then we're going to close it off. So you said a lot in that. I think maybe before I get to the question, can you summarize? Because the original question was, what is the decision people need to make? So what is the
well? So taking your yoke upon me, which is the idea of the call, the purpose of God is really, that's the idea of yoke is job. That's you're in the yoke together with Jesus. So you are laboring together with him. So you become a laborer in his harvest field. You become a part of Jesus' work, and in working with him, you are, in essence, an apprentice. And so that's the idea: is you become an apprentice of Jesus.
Cool. All right. So here's our question that came in. I've heard you say it's easier to steer a moving train than to move a stopped one in regards to stepping out in faith. How do you know if you're moving presumptuously instead of by faith? That question having to deal with what you said about moving too fast and getting a bad layer in 3D printing. Actually,
yeah. And so the idea of presumption is, really presumption, for the most part, presumption is you really don't care whether or not it's God. You haven't you haven't wrestled that element through, that idea of, you know, is this God? You know, it's just, the attitude is just, I heard a voice and I'm going to move on it, you know. And so that's the idea, because everything needs wisdom and discretion. You know, that's, be wise as serpents, gentle as doves. I mentioned that in my sermon last week, and or on Sunday. And that idea of being wise as serpents is the idea of being cautious and careful. You know, learning how to be cautious and careful, so you don't just run off and do the first thing that pops into your mind. Is you're you know, working it through. You don't just jump out, do or die. You know, and so then, you know, presumption usually is that. Presumption usually is you're going to make a decision and it's a do or die thing that you're going to do. And I know people who've made decisions like that, and at the end of it, there's no way out of it. There's no way out of the decision. And so they make the decision, and there's no way out of that decision once they've made the decision. And that's not a good place to be. In anything, when you're serving God and doing the will of God, God never puts you in a place to where you have to do this and you have to do this right now. He never does that. That's not the case. There's always opportunity to think about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. All right. That's it for tonight. I think we've covered a lot of ground, actually, and I think we're in a good direction. And so I hope this was helpful for you tonight. Obviously, we do this to be a resource to you in general. Hopefully, if you're watching after the fact, you're able to join us live next week. We'll be here again, same time, same place. You can check out our YouTube channel for more resources. The sermons are online, and more than anything else, though, if you're here in the local area, in the San Francisco Bay, we would invite you to join us for our midweek service tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, here at our church building, and we'll put the address up here in a second. But again, encourage you to join us in person or live next week, and we look forward to being here again. See you guys later.